Great. Welcome, everyone. I am excited to see a lot of you virtually with us today. My name is Asim I Khwaja. I am the Director for the Center for International Development at Harvard University. CID is the hub at Harvard University for international development work. And we're very excited today to host this session with everyone. So let me give you a bit of background on what the session is about, and then without further ado, I'll jump straight in to our session. So what CID has been hoping to do is really what I think will be a calling for a lot of us in the decades to come. And my guess is generations down will ask us, what did you do? What happened and what did you do in the year 2020 and the year 2021? This is a once in a century kind of event. It's a once in a century kind of shock. And very much what we're hoping to do is figure out ways to respond to this shock. And I wanted to say one thing, it's been a tough year for many. It's been a year of loss for many at personal levels, at collective levels. But one of the things we're hoping to bring to this series that we're starting, which we're calling Beyond COVID, is to think about all the silver linings, all the lessons that we have learned, which perhaps we would not have learned. We were forced to learn in many ways, and whether we can take those lessons and implement them in a way that can bring about positive change, bring about pivot points to the rest of the world. And so that's kind of the intent. In this big kind of multi-year project we're starting, one of the events we are beginning to do is this Beyond COVID panel and speaker series. And we'll have a series of these events. This is our first inaugural event, and I'm very grateful to the speakers and the panelists who've joined us today. This month, we're focusing on education with this panel event and a series of podcasts featuring various faculty of ours who've been working in education in these spaces. Next month, we'll have a similar event on health, and after that on kind of macroeconomics and growth more broadly. And I welcome you to all of them. Before we begin, I should also say, if any of you are interested in engaging with us, both in terms of attending or participating in these events, but also in terms of this big initiative we're starting, there is a link in the chat. Feel free to visit that. And there's emails of individuals you can connect with to follow up. I'm especially interested in saying that because just judging from the attendees we've had for the event, you do represent people from across 40 countries in the world, from foundations, from organizations and academics and students. And I would like us to think that we are in this together, that even though you're hearing from a small set of people today, very much a lot of the ideas and aspirations you have hopefully will get reflected in the discussion we have today. But also, if not, then these are conversations we invite you to be a part of going forward as well. With that, let me talk about this event specifically, but also the speaker series. Really, the focus, as I said earlier in these series, is to get us to think very carefully. And these are questions I will pose to our panelists about three specific things. And we're going to open up hearing from each panelist on those three specific things. And those three specific things are, what have we in education, and we have amazing expertise in this room today, seen as kind of the biggest challenge, the biggest loss created due to the pandemic? That's the first. The second, what are the signs of some hope that we see in our response as this pandemic played out within education? And then third, and most importantly for us, what are the lessons we can take forward in the coming years so that not only do we recover, but in some sense, we do even better than we would have otherwise. These lessons have put us on a better trajectory of learning, of inclusivity than we would have otherwise. And those are the questions I'm going to pose. With that, let me briefly introduce our panelists. You have detailed bios of the panelists. There's no way I can do justice in the time we have on their backgrounds, but I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they will speak. Two of our panelists are our own faculty affiliates, faculty members of Howard University and faculty affiliates of CID. And the third is a guest we have, especially who is representing kind of UNESCO and the kind of what amazing policies and practice initiatives have been made there. The first panelist will be Michela Carlana. Michela is an assistant professor of public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, has done really fabulous work in education. I still remember when she first joined us and the work she presented, which was looking at kind of discrimination by teachers, especially in girls, against girls in math related fields. And since then, true to Michela fashion, she's pivoted and has been doing a lot of work in trying to get at online education for kids who are suffering and missed it. And so there's super exciting effort she's been doing, and we'll hear from her. Second, we have Stefania Giannini, who's joining us. She is the Assistant Director General for Education for UNESCO, and very much in the middle of the firestorm, in the middle of amazing sort of challenges that have been posed. And we're going to hear from her and get a much more global perspective on what's going on and kind of what the opportunities are, what's on the Education 2030 agenda, and how is that kind of changing with COVID. And finally, someone who I've learned a tremendous amount from, a real giant in the field of education, Fernando Reimers, who is the Ford Foundation Professor of Practice of International Education and the Director of Global Education Innovation Initiative at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And I love a lot of Fernando's work, but the part I really am inspired by is Fernando's work on thinking through developing things like 21st century skills, to use a language that Fernando has used, which is not just math and science and literacy, but thinking about kind of the broader skills that one needs to develop to succeed in the world, to succeed in the labor force. And it'd be really fascinating to hear how those have been affected again by the pandemic. So with that in mind, I'm going to request the panelists to take maybe 4 or 5 minutes in the beginning to just kind of make their opening statements on these 3 questions I posed, and just to remind us, what has been the biggest kind of challenge, what are the signs, the positive signs you've seen in our response, and what are the lessons going forward. So with Michela, I'm going to start with you, and thank you again for joining the panel.
Thank you so much, Asim, for this very nice introduction and for organizing this series of events. So the pandemic has affected both the learning, but also the social opportunities of children, with serious implications for their achievement and overall the well-being, the psychological well-being of students, in particular for those students that come from a disadvantaged background. So the disruption of learning and social environment risk to cast long shadows in the future of next generation entering into the labor market. This makes it so important for us, from what we are doing today, and try to learn a lesson from this crisis to make not the education system simply what it was before, but better compared to what it was before. So the sense of hope for me is that the pandemic has led several schools, teachers, and policymaker-led experimentation and innovation and improvement in our school system. So the education system can learn from this development so that the schools became more effective, innovative, and especially more equitable. So the pandemic indeed showed that very clearly that inequalities in our education system needed to be addressed. And in particular, students from low socioeconomic backgrounds may find it more difficult to study from home, may suffer from internet connectivity issues, may lack parental support at home. But a lot of these issues were there even before the pandemic. They needed to be addressed, and there was still this huge gap that now we have a great opportunity to somehow try to make some steps and improve upon. We know that access to technology is necessary, but is not sufficient to lead to a change. We need to create an innovative school system to transmit somehow valuable job market skills to all students. So schools has changed during the past couple of years, and hopefully we have a bunch of lessons that we learned and we can use to build this more equitable and innovative system for education. So my first lesson is related to teacher training. There's been an impressive amount of teacher training all around the world in the past year and a half on digital pedagogy and new technology. There is a strong mismatch between the skills required in the labor market and the skills that are often taught at school, and the process that started during the pandemic to try to improve the skills of teachers and align them with what is required by new technology, I think should not stop and should be seen as moving forward as a key point. So the second aspect, and this is, as you said in the introduction, something I've worked a lot on, is on tutoring. In the past year and a half, all around the world, I've been working in several Latin American countries and Europe, and tutors have been offering important resources as digital mediators, but also as a direct support for learning and the overall well-being of students. They can be a useful resource, not only during the online teaching, but also moving forward, providing not just remedial, but also accelerated learnings in the years post pandemic. The third key lesson that I would take from this pandemic is related to structural changes in school systems. We had a strong innovation that came in very disruptively in few weeks in the school system all around the world, and included a strong digital learning infrastructure, interactive activities. Schools started to be more flexible in terms of timing and exploiting opportunities from online learning. For example, the presence of potentially role models that can connect asynchronous and meet directly with the student, with some opportunities that would not be possible just exploiting in-person interaction. This is also a third component that I would stress as a lesson to keep going forward. And finally, my last point is related to data, measurement, and evidence-based policies. In the past year and a half, we saw how much this matters. This matters to understand the magnitude of the issue and trying to act fast where most of the need and the resources are necessary. And I really hope that this awareness on the importance of data and evidence-based policy will help taking the lessons forward to overcome educational losses and build a much better and more resilient education system.
Thank you, Michela. That was very comprehensive and very interesting. So I hope we'll pick up on some of these themes as we go along in the open discussion. Stefania, let me turn over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. First of all, Asim, thanks for inviting me in this very timely conversation with so great friends and some of them at least and great speakers. Well, I'm addressing the three questions, actually, what we've learned, what we've lost, and whether we can hope or not. I'm just telling you that I'm giving some bad news and some good news. And the good news will be more and more importantly, projecting to the future, more relevant than the bad news. So let me start, putting in my current shoes. As you said, I'm responsible of the education sector as UNESCO since 2018. I've been, before this experience, Minister of Education and University Research in my country, which is Italy. So I joined UNESCO with the hope and the certainty that this global observatory could really give me the opportunity to contribute a little bit with all my team and colleagues and partners to accelerate this so amazing, ambitious agenda of 2030 agenda of the UN system, bringing education as one of the main pillars, right, to achieve all the other goals. We started monitoring the SDG 4, and I'm thinking of high-level forum in New York 2019, we were very much aware that SDG 4 was not on track. A lot of gaps, a lot of challenges, and still a lot, including financial gaps, and a lot of work to do. Having said that, in a few months, the world changed dramatically with a huge impact on education. And UNESCO was, from the very beginning of the process, on the front line of this crisis. And the impact, I started with the big losses we could see from the very beginning was huge, unprecedented. Just to mention some numbers that maybe you all already have in mind, at the peak of the pandemic, April last year, 1.6 billion students and learners were out of school because of the pandemic and because of schools closures and universities closures. Today, while we are talking, close to 700 million students in around 60 countries are still affected by partial or full school closures. And this is an unprecedented situation we were facing. So I would say that ironically, somehow, the biggest loss has been one of connection with everything that schools actually represent, schools and learning spaces, places not only of learning, crucially, they are about that, but also of social interaction, protection, vital services, nutrition, collaborative projects. And I say ironically because while technology has been the red line, the lifeline for millions, assuring in some countries and in some constituencies continuity of learning, UNESCO was very much focusing on that side since the beginning. We established a global education coalition with partners, and we are very much keen to give solutions, not only monitoring the process and the losses, but it has also led to isolation and exclusion. So this is the bad news. Of course, we are not yet able to measure the long-term impact, as Michela mentioned, is not simply the here and now consequences of this crisis. There is the social-emotional side. There is the long-term perspective that we'll be able to evaluate in the coming months and maybe years. Let me just mention another number I still have in mind. Last year, we evaluated that in addition to the 260 million students out of school already, excluded by the journal, educational journey, will have plus 25 million of learners at risk of dropout. Out of them, 11 million girls. So it's a huge impact in the coming years and months and years. Having said that, we already learned some lessons, and this starts the good part of the story. I mean, the happy part, and there will be also an happy end, in my opinion, just to put it positively. And the nice thing, the interesting thing that the immediate urgency is to leave no one behind, of course, more than ever, and to collect the data to identify those who are actually more at risk now, more than before. The importance of data collection, the importance of moving together in a different way to establish a new kind of partnership within the education, international education community has been a very clear lessons we learned since the beginning. And then if you ask me now, Stefania, do you think that UNESCO, UNICEF, the World Bank, I mean, other NGOs very much keen to give solutions, especially focusing on developing countries, are doing the same job? I say you no. Now we are very much focusing on a common agenda. Now priorities are, leveraging technology, but putting technology at the service of learners and not neglecting the human side of teaching and learning. We are very much focusing on teachers because we understand that teachers are the frontline workers, somehow like medical doctors in hospitals. If you allow me to keep this comparison we actually naturally did. So lessons come from an unprecedented situation. And this brings me to the last point of this first round, for sure. Can we still hope? I think so. Education has come to the center of the political stage as never before. And the frontline campaign issues in many countries, supported by us as the international community, but also ministers being from the very beginning on the front line as never before, with debates focusing on social integration, inequalities, the need to put education now in this current, interesting phase of recovery of the public policies. That means invest in education more and not less than before. I mean, all these issues are very much something which comes from the crisis. So each crisis, I'm a classical philologist as a background, and the ancient Greek word crisis is, I pronounce like in ancient Greek, comes from a word which is krino, the verb, which means I distinguish, I separate, I take the opportunity to see which is the right thing to do or not. And this is what we are taking from the crisis. So a key word, maybe we can develop a little bit, elaborate later, is that education systems now are kind of laboratories of innovation. And there is a huge need of regenerating the system. So maybe it's a kind of inspiring situation for us as UN officials very keen to sustainability. Maybe sustainability is no more enough. We must go beyond. We must regenerate the system, and education is a big part of the solution. So this is the message of hope I'm keeping from the crisis.
Stefania, that was beautiful. I love the philologist in you kind of breaking up the word crisis and reminding us what it means, and that it's actually a criteria. It's a way of sifting out what works and what doesn't work. And I think that's a beautiful thought. I'm also really excited, I think, in the discussion coming back to some of the broader themes you've touched on, everywhere from like political support for education, making it a centerpiece, to more coordination across agencies. I'm also going to be, I want to get a little argument started between you and Michela about Italy, given all her work was in Italy, and you have been leading those efforts. So, I think it'll be fun to come back to, but in a more serious way, to say, even when you look at one country, what's changed over there. And I think Michela, from her experience in schools and from your experience as representing education, it'll be fun to kind of have that conversation too. But let me, before we do that, let me turn to Fernando. Fernando, all yours.
Thanks, Asim. Let me first say what a pleasure it is to be with Stefania and Michela on this panel. And let me thank you, Asim, for your leadership in getting this university to pay attention to this issue. This pandemic is serious stuff. It is going to alter the course of history. And I think this is a time when each and every one of the 28,000 universities in the world should be asking, what is our responsibility? Because there is no question in my mind that if this is not going to lead to really devastating consequences in human development and in social organization, it'll be because we have the resources, the leadership, the knowledge, and the capacity to address the huge challenges in front of us, which are not just educational challenges. And in that task, I think universities have a big role to play. So thank you. So on the first question, what's the story? Well, as Michela and Stefania have said, this is a story of tremendous loss. But what I want to emphasize is that it's not a single story. And I've spent the last 18 months studying the educational impact of COVID. And I've just placed a link on the chat to a recent book, which is a comparative study of the impact. And what you see in that book is that this pandemic, the educational impact of this pandemic is mediated by nationality, because the choices that governments made were very consequential, the educational and the public health choices that they made. Subnational, because there were important differences across states, and in many cases, in the absence of adequate national responses, states actually stepped up to the plate and did in some cases, pretty good things. Absolutely a story mediated by social class. One of the things that we learn is that when the school moved to the home, we discover how much of a leveler of opportunity the public school is with all its imperfections. And when you learn at home, all the differences in the social advantages from different kids become even more visible than they were. And there were other mediators, right? Institutional capacity, readiness. There were systems. For example, the state of Jalisco in Mexico had been advancing a plan to basically connect all the schools in the internet and develop digipedagogies. What the pandemic did is help them accelerate something that was in the works. And today, 85% of their schools have access to fiber optics. Wouldn't have happened as quickly without the pandemic. And the rural schools, they're reaching with microwave. And all their teachers had an immersion in trying digipedagogies. But the story for the most vulnerable, which is what we should be concerned about, is a terrible story of lack of engagement. Everywhere that I have looked, dropout rates are increasing. You know, the numbers are not striking in some cases. I've looked at these in various states in Mexico. It looks like, you know, an additional 5%, 6% of the kids who have dropped out. But we don't really know what dropping out means, because the kids that are in the books in this context of learning at home, we don't really know how engaged they are. But there is definitely evidence of dropout in the few countries where we have measured learning. In the traditional subjects, no question that there is learning loss, that this generation is less skilled than comparable generations 2 years ago. And then there is all the stuff that we don't know, what the impact has been on social emotional. All the evidence is that, look, an event that impacts 240 million humans who have been infected up till now, and where you know that being infected means you could lose your life. And if you do a simple estimate that each of those persons has 3 close relatives, that means 1 in 8 humans. That means every one of us knows somebody who's been traumatized, who has contemplated the possibility that they or someone close to them could die. We don't know yet what this does to children or what this does to teachers, but I suspect it's a little hard to focus on your math when you think your mother may be dying, or when you actually lost your father to this thing, or a sibling. So there's a lot we don't know about the impact of the trauma that this has created, but I'm thinking this is no different than the impact of a war in many people, right? And then what we don't know is what this has done to engagement, with the place that schooling plays in the priorities of people. So that's the story of loss for the poor. But I do think it's imperative to keep an eye on the future and to ask ourselves useful questions. And the useful questions are, so what's the silver lining? And the silver lining, as Stefania was saying, is one of tremendous innovation that we haven't fully codified. There are many good things that have happened institutionally, programmatically, and pedagogically. Institutionally, I've placed a link to a book where over the last 16 months, we studied how universities during this pandemic partnered with school systems to help them innovate and not only sustain educational opportunity, but actually do better. It's a remarkably hopeful story to see what MIT, to see what Arizona State University, to see what the Universidad de Guadalajara did in actually asking themselves, what's our obligation to society? Not how are we going to teach our students, not how are we going to take care of ourselves, how are we going to serve those who don't have a chance to come to university? And I'm thinking this is a moment where I hope every university president, every dean, every trustee is asking themselves the question, what's our obligation to society, among other things, because there are many people who ask themselves, who are universities serving? There are many people who look at our university with the endowment that we have, and they ask, are you a university or a huge hedge fund with a little university attached to it? And it's a fair question to ask. And I think in response to that question, we should actually learn from places that have actually made it a real priority to try to be of service to society at this time. So there's been institutional innovation. There's been programmatic innovation, no question about it. UNESCO is going to publish next week, the International Bureau of Education, a book that we have produced over the last 6 months, in which we took a framework. One of the things that UNESCO has done thrice in its history is to put together a commission to think about the future of education. And Stefania did that 3 years ago, put together with the Director General a commission to think about the future of education. This report is going to be published on November the 10th. It will be public. And so we took that report, and through that lens, we looked at 31 innovations that had taken place in the pandemic. In other words, we revert the lens to look at the pandemic, not as an opportunity, not as an occasion for loss, but we said, what good things happen that are in line with this vision of the future, that anticipate what this commission is suggesting is a system that is not just mitigating the loss, is a system that is addressing pre-existing deficits. We forget right now, 18 months into this pandemic, that the schools before the pandemic weren't all wonderful, that there were many kids who were not included, that they were not learning the right things, that they were not learning very much. So those are the things we have to address. That's why I think this narrative of recovering learning loss and going back to where we were is a very poor narrative. It's a narrative of low expectations, because what we need to do actually is to reinvent schools. And I have a sense that the pandemic, as Stefania was saying, has actually opened a window of opportunity where more people are now paying attention to what schools do, and where perhaps they're even more ready for this conversation. And then there is a story of pedagogical innovation. What we try to do with this book that UNESCO is publishing is actually model an approach and invite every educational institution to take stock of innovations that have taken place and to ask what happened has value for the future. And I think many of these innovations are actually innovations of management, not necessarily pedagogical. I'll give you a simple example. One of the innovations that we study is a network of 11 schools that serve very poor children in Colombia in partnership with a university. The innovation predated the pandemic. It's been around for 15 years. It's been studied. It's a great model. But during the pandemic, what they did was begin to manage themselves differently. All these large structures, as you know, are essentially silos where communication moves up and down the silo. And then at the top, there is lateral communication. In this pandemic, no one could function like that. So they began to use technology to convene frequent and short meetings at all levels of the system that allowed them to begin to generate efficiencies, to generate synergies, to produce innovation more quickly. Another innovation, give you an idea, the country of Vietnam in 4 weeks produced an entire curriculum on television involving most schools in the country, essentially teaching teachers how to produce educational television, how to produce digital assets, and putting that online. I'm not discussing right now whether that curriculum was as effective as in-person instruction. Hasn't been evaluated, but my guess is it hasn't been. But the fact that a country can produce in 4 weeks an entire curriculum in television is remarkable. Colombia, this alliance that I'm describing, mobilized 500 teachers from different schools, and in 3 weeks, put the entire curriculum on radio that could be delivered on WhatsApp, on the web. I think it's very important that we ask ourselves, because one of the things the pandemic did is upended the rules through which the systems are normally governed. And let's face it, these rules sometimes are part of the problem. The mechanisms of procurement, the ways in which people communicate, who can talk to who, the barriers to participation of civil society and the private sector. And in this pandemic, as the ship was sinking, these rules were suspended. And all of a sudden, people could try new things and new actors could come to the table. And I mean, people did remarkable things. Private publishers donated their assets during the pandemic for the common good. So I think it's very, very important that we take the time to take stock of those things, to analyze them, and to say, what is relevant going forward? Because I have no illusions. I don't want to paint a Pollyannish vision that almost makes us wish we had this pandemic. This is a time from hell that could bring us the breakdown of democracy. And I'm not exaggerating. You probably have read the report of the National Defense Council published a few months ago that talks about the most serious risks to American democracy. A third of that report is about the pandemic and what it has done to social fragmentation. And if you pay attention to social fragmentation and the vulnerability of democracy around the world, you realize we are in deep doo-doo. But in that context, I think it is very important that we don't despair and that we find hope in what we learned during the pandemic, that allowed systems and teachers and partnerships to innovate in unprecedented velocity. So that's what I wanted to say right now.
Fernando, thank you so much. That was just fabulous. Gosh, I don't even know where to begin. Between the three of you, you have raised so many significant and substantial issues. But let me start with, I think, something Fernando reminded us, and each one of you alluded to as well, which is this theme of inequity and inclusivity. I think that's the right place to start our discussion right now. There are many other things we've touched, but I want to focus, I want to bring all three of you back to and revisit that. There's another thing you said, which I want to put it in that context, which is technology, right? And clearly one big innovation has been, whether it be us learning how to have Zoom webinars or teaching our classes online, or the examples Fernando gave and others we've heard. And I want to bring the two together. If indeed technology is going to be a critical thing for us, and we're worried about systems which were always unequal, right? And to Fernando, your point, if anything, they became more unequal as we went back home and tried to produce education at home. What are we seeing there? What is your sense of that? Are we fundamentally, and Stefania, also to you, when you talk about the policy awareness on these things, are we fundamentally seeing the inequity in the system? And is a lot of our responses now going to take that more seriously? And if so, how is technology being used? Is that going to be an enabler of reducing inequality, or is that going to worsen inequality? So I want to pose that back to you. And perhaps we can start maybe in reverse order this time. So Fernando, if you want to go first on it, and then we kind of cycle back.
Happy to do it. I think that the pandemic is both a cause for great humility with respect to technology and of great hope. The pandemic basically helped us see how irresponsible some of the hopes we had for technology. I don't know if you're familiar with that famous talk from Sugata Mitra, in which he says, abolish schools, give every kid a laptop. I've put a computer in a slum in Mumbai, and the kids will teach themselves what they need. We now know, given this pandemic, that that was a big, bold-faced lie, and that we shouldn't even try to do it, that we shouldn't try to destroy schools, because we realize now how many important things happen when kids come together with each other and with adults who simply tell them, I care about you, and where there is more of a leveling playing field than their home. So in that sense, this has been humble. The fact that we all had to jump into technology very quickly, in what was really an act of improvisation in most cases, rather than really planful design, showed us what was possible, but also how much we need to learn to use these things responsibly. So there is no question that we're going to see a huge priority in hybridizing education systems, in doing what Jalisco has done, in saying in the 21st century, it is unacceptable for someone not to have access to connectivity, to device, and to the skills to use it. Because if you don't have that, it's not that you don't have access to education, it's that you can't participate in society. And I'm glad that that is visible. And that's going to require a huge investment in infrastructure and in education. But I'm glad we're there. I'm glad we understand this is going to happen. Good things are going to happen. In this book, the 31 innovations, I think they all involve technology in one way or another, but not in the ways I would have expected before the pandemic. It's not mostly about pedagogy. For example, technology to engage families, to augment the capacity of the school, creating productive ways to get the parents to work with their kids. There's been wonderful things that have taken place and which I hope we're not going to lose. I was mentioning Jalisco a moment ago. I think now it's 90% of the parents in that state have an internet account and are in communication with the system. It wasn't happening before. And so certainly that system isn't going to let go of that. That's not going to replace the school, but I think that is going to augment the school. What I'm hoping is we're going to use technology to help enrich the curriculum and the opportunities for the students, not just to catch up in developing the competencies they didn't develop, but to be equipped for what they need in the future, to personalize learning, to allow them to experience different forms of learning, which are not always guided by a teacher in front of them, leading them through the nose. So I think technology is here to stay. I think we're going to see a big priority in blending education systems. In the short term, yes, I think that some of the inequities that we saw were because there were differences between countries and within societies in terms of access and skill in using these technologies. And I expect that maybe the next, I don't know, whether it's the next 5 or 10 years, we will see an increase in inequality as we introduce technology. But I'm thinking that it's inevitably, we can't escape it. We cannot educate children in the 21st century and not give them the skills to learn on their own. When you read this report on the futures of education, the report is big on lifelong learning, on really building an ecosystem that allows people the opportunity to learn all the time. How do you do that without technology? And more importantly, without the capacities of people to learn on their own, to be able to find what they need and to learn it. And that needs to start in school. And it can only start in school if the school is augmented, is blending. So let me just finish. I want to be very clear. I'm not saying that if the school day is 5 hours, we're going to take 3 hours, they're going to be face-to-face, 2 hours online. No, I'm saying 5 hours should be face-to-face, and we should have 3 additional hours, which are digital.
Great, Fernando. Stefania, I want to continue this conversation with you, but then perhaps put you on the spot and say, one issue with technology, what we've seen is not just device inequities, but also just broadband. Even when data exists, data is expensive. And as you answer this question, if you could, are there efforts to try and make data for education free, to make broadband for education free? Can we convert the conversation in from the UN's kind of stature connectivity to say, look, these following IP addresses, if you access these education materials, no matter what device you have, that data will be free for you. I'm just posing that question, but there's many other responses you have. So I'm putting you on the spot for that one, but I'd love to hear more generally.
Thank you very much, Asim, and thanks, Fernando, for his, as usual, brilliant and quite focused description of the complexity we are living. And I'm happy that you raised up among many issues we can discuss about inequalities and technology. They are very much linked somehow. And let me share with you an initiative which is running in the coming weeks, and just coming from an information meeting with member states on that, which tries to bring together these two dimensions and building a framework for member states and education communities in order to leverage the power of technology in order to address inequalities and not making technology one of the enabling factors to widen inequalities already existing. So we are presenting in December, the beginning of December this year, what we call a global declaration on connectivity for education. This is an initiative that UNESCO is launching in order to mobilize attention on the importance of this topic, promoted by Dubai Cares, which is one of our main partners. They're very much keen to address inequalities around the world, especially in the global south. And I wish to briefly explain why now and which is the main purpose of this initiative. I mean, why now? Believe it or not, is the pandemic of dramatically escalated reliance on technology and connectivity. But on the other side, as already mentioned, 1/3 of education population, the world education population and learners have been excluded because of lack of connectivity and not having access to the internet at home. For much of last academic year, 2020-2021, computers and internet connections replaced temporarily schools and somehow dictated whether hundreds of millions of students could access educational opportunities. And what we have now, while many schools have reopened, but not in all countries, as I mentioned at the beginning, the digital transformation of education continues to accelerate with more and more teaching and learning being moved to virtual spaces. So it's now the time to better understand about how to steer the integration of technology in education, driven by some important for us, the red lines, the baselines, principles like education, technology in education must be inspired by inclusion as a main principle. That means rethinking the concept of right to education, including connectivity as one of the components. I cannot assure to provide the right to education to children in the world without giving connectivity to all and filling the gap that the digital divide is still keeping. Over 3/4 of distance learning solutions available during the pandemic relied exclusively on live platforms. Then, of course, as Fernando mentioned, we also from UNESCO Global Observatory, could see very many creative solutions. The hybrid model is maybe the main lessons learned in terms of pedagogical solutions, but still the continuity of learning has been assured by online platforms. So the first point is to fill this gap, and we must mobilize political attention, member states' commitment, and financial resources, additional resources, in order to work on these three main dimensions. One is connectivity itself. The second is digital infrastructures. That means devices. That means all the tools that education communities, learners as well as teachers must have. And the third dimension is digital skills. That means either teachers or learners were not prepared to move overnight, almost overnight, to a new learning environment. And now we know that not simply thinking of other shocks, we hope that this pandemic is over in a few months, and we hope that we'll not have another something in a few years. But having said that, we know that if we don't address these important and urgent issue, technology in education, to overcome the big challenges that this unprecedented situation actually brought out, will be really very much behind than before the crisis. So this means mobilizing also additional funds. On the 10th November at UNESCO, we'll have a big, the global education meeting with ministers, also ministers of finance, because it's important to start to make these two word dialogue and interacting between them, and heads of state committing to reinvest in education, especially because of that.
So just before I move to Michela, one follow-up question on that. In this grand consensus, which is great, are you also getting the big giants, the big tech giants to show up? Is these guys offer connectivity in lots of places? Take something like Google. Are they willing to come in and kind of at cost or fully subsidized provide connectivity?
Good question. Thanks for asking me. Well, since the beginning of the crisis, I mentioned we established what we call the Global Education Coalition, and the very first partners to join were not the usual suspects, so to say, the sister agency that of course are fully on board. There were Microsoft, there were Amazon, there were these big companies, high-tech, but not exclusively high-tech, which were keen to help international organizations and education systems to provide solutions. From the very beginning, we said, look, these are our ethical principles: data protection, privacy of data of learners and teachers, free solutions, at least to address the main challenges of the very first phase, and so on. And this is the deal, the big deal, new deal that we got with them. Now, it's another story. I mean, now we are moving beyond the pandemic. No, we are between recovery and resilience, so to say. And now that's why we are provoking a debate around a declaration on connectivity, because one of the main stakeholders we want to bring around the table and to have fully on board in terms of their own responsibility or sharing a collective responsibility on this issue is about the private sector and the big companies. If you ask me, I'm optimist in terms of their genuine intention to be part of the solution and not to be on the other side of the river. I think yes, with prudently, in the sense that they understand that the future is very much about transparency, accountability, and being accountable for the consequence of their business models. So I do believe that they are somehow obliged to be part of this global debate. And it's a process, of course, it takes time, but I think that this is another takeaway, another lessons already learned by this pandemic.
Great, thanks, Stefania. Before I jump into Michela and hear from her, just feel free to, we're going to open up in a few minutes into the chat group, and so feel free to post questions and we'll kind of pull them from the audience and pose them to the panelists. Michela, as you respond to this inequality question, one thing you've thought a lot about is not just inequality along SES lines, but inequality, exclusion on other dimensions, bias, gender for one, immigrant status for another. And so as you think through technology, can you also respond to us about whether that would exacerbate those kind of biases, those forms of exclusion, or are there ways to actually to mitigate those kind of biases as well?
Mm-hmm. So there are, I've been working a lot on both like biases against girls in schools, and often like this is actually strongly connected with like access to technology that is linked with like more males in the school. And I think there is still a lot to do. So I've been like evaluating like a bunch of projects. One is like Girls Code It Better. That is a version of Girls Who Code that for people of Kennedy School was actually one of our students that was a founder of that project. And this was like a spin-off that was implemented in Italy, that has been implemented in Italy for the past 8 years. And what we are really trying to do is like show different connection between technology and women, and show them the different role models that can make it like more accessible, and like try to break these barriers that every time like we talk about technology or we think about how to exploit and be creative of using technology, we often have like these stereotypes that men should be at the forefront. Girls like are amazing in doing like coding. The first like coders were actually women when this was coding was invented. So this should be something that we work along the line with the new technology that we try to implement. And so we should like be careful in how we design the programs to make sure that if, for example, we started to include like a coding within the school system, that is something that is one of those skills that is as a high price, like on the labor market. So this is something that really, I believe the schooling system should like teach more to our students. And on the other hand, we needed to do that in a way that is truly inclusive to make sure that we don't like leave half of our population out of like learning those skills, because either the stereotypes of people that are implementing this program are associating with the fact that the boys may like that more, and so they are more likely to encourage boys to follow those paths. I think like there is a very important like a challenge ahead with this new technology, and we should really jump on top of that and make sure that we take this as a opportunity for inclusivity. In the second like a key aspect that I've been working a lot is like on the exclusion of immigrant children. And so both like, so one of the projects I've been working in the past like 18 months is on the tutoring online project that is, this is called TOP. And we try to get like children that are coming from a disadvantaged background and try to give them like a free university student. Again, like coming back to one of the first point of Fernando, creating this link between university and like the real world, and try to make sure that the university has a mission to help student and the society as abroad. And I think here like the challenge is especially for those vulnerable people, and we have a high share of immigrant, especially like in European countries among those. Immigrant children tend to have like low access to device. They tend to have like more brothers and sisters, which implies that even if they do have a device, they have to share it with more people. And this may create like a true barrier for learning. On the positive side of the story, I've seen that there was like some public-private partnership, a little bit building on what Stefania was saying before, that was trying to provide at least like this, I know that was very strong in Italy, that was trying to provide like devices and like a connectivity to all the students that were lacking one. And a huge share of those devices went to children from an immigrant background because they had these additional challenges compared to native children. So this is something that we should keep in mind. And we should keep in mind because it's not just related to learning, but is related to more broadly to the well-being of individuals. During the pandemic, we also collected data in some countries, Italy and Latin American countries where I've been working, on the psychological well-being of students. And those that were struggling the most were immigrant children. So immigrant children had the lowest level of psychological well-being. They had a higher level of depression. They didn't have anyone to talk with and get connected with outside their home. And so for those people, really making sure that we provide innovative solutions to connect them and try to help and make like our system really inclusive and making like the system being able to reach the every single child with like different method is what we should learn from this pandemic, and this is something that we have definitely opportunities to improve upon, and like a lot of like new project and innovation that has been tried out that can help reaching both like women and like with their stereotypes in tech, and also these immigrant children that do have like a connectivity issue and a connection issue with like the school system. And these are also the children coming back. I think it was Fernando talking about the dropout. These are the children that are at risk of dropping out. And we have the highest, we may not see it now, because now like the requirement is so low, like almost in all countries, we are decreasing like the standards for passing the grade. But in few years, people will come at a point in which they will be made accountable for what they actually know. And there is where we will see like the biggest dropout. We don't see it like huge dropout now. We see some dropout, but not huge. But we will see more in the years to come when we will start to go back like to the same standards we were expecting in terms of learning of the students.
Great, thank you, Michela. I see some really excellent questions, both in the Q&A and some in the chat. So let me relinquish my deep desire to ask you more questions and turn to, I think, our audience. Faye, I don't know how you want to do this. We have several questions I see, and we only have 15 minutes left. So do you want to kind of try and parse out these questions, have people pose them themselves, or whatever you think is the most sufficient at this stage. The intent is to get as many of those questions as answered as possible. What I would say to the panelists is feel free to pick 1 or 2 questions. We don't have to each answer every one to kind of maximize coverage. Faye, you want to just start?
Yes, sure. Thank you, everyone. So it looks like we have a few questions coming in. So what I'll do is I'll pose 3 questions at a time, and then you can answer them as you see fit, and we'll continue from there. So first 3 questions that we've received. The first is from Mana, who asks, leveraging technology and teachers training seems to be the prevailing themes right now post-COVID, but can we talk about the possible ways to leverage family engagement in education and out-of-school learning opportunities? While all schools were locked down, families were essential players with minimal support or training. That's the first question. Second question from Zainab. She asks, we see islands of innovation all around the world and a lot of talk about global public goods. But post-COVID, how are we thinking about nurturing innovation systematically and allowing local innovation and successful endeavors to bubble up and grow? And then third, from Carlos, given limited financial resources, how do you think countries should balance and prioritize infrastructure and skill building investment, especially considering the implementation complexity at a large scale of capacity building?
So I'm just going to pose this to the panelists. Anyone want to pick any one of these and jump straight in?
If I may jump, Asim, yeah, just quickly on the last one, prioritizing investment, how, you know, politics is about decision, making the decision according to the needs of your community. As I mentioned before, I carry the burden of being a member of a government in a European country. Of course, we didn't have a pandemic at that time, 2014, 2016. But over 3 years, I realized how it's to what extent it's important to first to have a all government approach to big decisions and to address big challenges. And especially in this unprecedented situation, I think that governments are taking this approach. Now, the big initiatives that all governments in the world are actually running are green transition and ecological transition, whatever you want to call it, and digital transition. And what is important that going and looking beyond the recovery phase, governments realize the importance of education as a part of the solution, as one of the main public policy which can contribute to that. So my answer to this question is that we have to provide clear data, as we are trying to do, about the cost of not investing now more in education. And on this basis, I'm sure that governments can prioritize both dimensions, infrastructures and skills, skilling and reskilling learners and teachers. And Great. This is a bit of the work we are doing in the international community.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Claudia. We have more questions pouring in. So Fernando, if I may ask you, if it's okay to respond to the innovation one, you mentioned several things about it. And then let's just keep our responses to a minute because I want to try to get more questions.
Can you quickly tell me what the question is? I can find it.
We see islands of innovation all around the world and a lot of talk about global public goods, but post-COVID, how are we thinking about nurturing innovation systematically and allowing local innovation and successful endeavors to bubble up and grow?
I think this is very important. And I think this is one of the things we should learn from what happened in the pandemic. In my view, it happened in the pandemic because governments made it easier to develop partnerships with civil society than they normally do. And because the private sector, not just civil society, perhaps was more generous than it normally is in actually understanding the importance of building global public goods. I mean, I think if you look at the challenges we have with inequality, there is no question we need to rethink capitalism. And this pandemic has made obvious how the path we're in is unsustainable. It's a path that is just augmenting initial inequalities, making it impossible for us to address public challenges like climate change. So in my view, this is going to require, on the innovation front, certainly recognizing that as an important asset and creating an infrastructure that can do that. And to me, that is about thinking about the problem of innovation on a different scale than we normally think. Too many people have this illusion that innovation can happen at the school level. And that's the wrong level at which you can solve problems. What the pandemic showed us is that you can, in a network of schools, even if it's only 11 schools, you can do things because of economies of scale, because of leveraging all the knowledge that is in that network that you couldn't possibly do in one. And then if you augment those 11 schools with one university, and in the case of Colombia, it happens to be the best university in the country, you can do amazing things that generate knowledge that is valuable, not just for the 11 schools, but the others. So we need to shift the level at which we think we can solve problems and recognize the power of networks, the power of partnerships, whether it's universities or other entities. But I do want to add to a question that I saw here, is it just about professional development and technology? No, I think it's very much about what we're trying to teach. As I think about the big challenges that the pandemic is leaving us, these are challenges of inequality and destitution, a lot more people who are vulnerable. So we need to think safety nets. You can only think safety nets if you build solidarity, if you educate people for solidarity. And our systems haven't been doing that very well. Second thing, climate change, which is the pandemic behind the pandemic. Every day we see a report that unless we take these head on, we're not going to survive on this planet. That is about what you teach. It's not about technology and professional development. It's about having effective curriculum to do that. We're going to need good governance. One of the casualties of this pandemic has been trust in government, interpersonal trust in institutions. And that is about education. That is about civic education. You learn trust, not blind trust, but you learn what it takes to build and to sustain trust as a result of experience. The fourth huge challenge is a challenge of jobs, which in the short term is going to get only worse because of automation and the development of AI. And so we need in a hurry to figure out how do we create jobs for people in addition to the safety net. And finally, of course, there is the education challenge, which I think is connected to all these other challenges. To me, that is not just about technology and professional development. It's about rethinking fundamentally what do we educate for. And that is actually the theme of this forthcoming report of UNESCO on the futures of education, which, by the way, if I could address it, it is going to be the first report of the 3 that UNESCO has published in its entire history that is actually not addressed just to governments. The previous 2 reports basically operated out of a mode that assumed if governments change their mindset, things will change. This report is addressed to each and every one of us. It's addressed to every parent. It's addressed to every teacher. And the report says what we're inviting to is a process of big social dialogue on what kind of education do we need to face the challenges that the report discusses. And the report says, essentially UNESCO says, we don't even hope to control this process. We have contributed what will be 10% of the process. We're hoping to unleash a process where it's going to take the Gretas of this world, the Malalas of this world, the universities of this world to figure out what does that mean for us and what is the next step.
Great, thanks so much, Fernando. Michela, can I have you respond to both the question about, you stressed a lot of teachers and getting teachers involved, but clearly this question is pushing back a bit and saying, what about home environments? And you talked a bit about that for the immigrant families. That, and also Faryal has a great question, which I want to kind of piggyback off this question. I don't know if you've seen it, but let me kind of read that out as well, which I think relates to what this is. And so if you could respond to both of them together. And that question is, let me just read it out. Could we not build on the momentum that the pandemic has created by enabling learners to have values, skills, and competencies to become proactive citizens who in turn play a role in transforming their communities and addressing global and local issues? It's like a ripple effect. Each learner goes back to his or her community and makes a difference. So if you kind of respond to both of these, that'll be great.
So yes, so in the first one, in terms of like a family environment and support, So this is actually a key issue, and like you're right that there was actually very little support for parents to get trained and to know how to actually support students. Except for like one case that I know very well is I don't know if you know this, the NGO Young Love, that have been like implementing this program across different countries, showing like impressive results of like a parents training during the pandemic and in the months afterwards, by simply like using personalized text messages to parents to try to give them like the skills and the possibility to help their children and improve the learning of their children. So this, I think, is like a great example on how much is important to think about how we train parents in order to be more engaged with like their children, and how we train parents to help children to learn more. Even in Botswana, where the study started, parents were very willing like to help. They just needed like more resources, and this is something that we can provide pretty easily, even with simple text messages, exploiting the fact that people like are getting like more connected right now. On the second point, I think this is like a very interesting case study, and I've been like working with this online tutoring based on volunteer university students. The first time we did like the call for university students to help others, we were hoping to get at least 200 volunteers. We got in 24 hours more than 2,000 people that applied. And this was in the middle of the pandemic. So at the beginning, we were like, maybe people just want to volunteer now in the middle of the pandemic. It will not happen again. We tried again when universities were open and these university students could enjoy life outside. And again, in very few hours, we got like an impressive response. And we replicated that. We started in Italy, we replicated in the Dominican Republic, and we got again like an even more impressive response compared to the one we had in Italy. And now it's going on in Uruguay, Brazil, and different countries. So my take on that is how much like these university students are willing, I have like social capital that they are willing to put at the service of the community to try to improve and help disadvantaged children and people that have been suffering during the pandemic. So I really believe that this will be like very important going ahead, and like somehow using these resources and like this willingness to help others becoming like proactive citizen, and like this I believe is also a great role model example for like the children that see this volunteer that is helping them to become like in the future that volunteer themselves and being proactive citizen that is helping others and they care about public good. So I believe there will be like a spin-off across generations on that.
Awesome. So I'm going to do something terribly unfair now. We have 2 minutes left. I want to be sticking to our time. I'm going to combine two questions and I'm going to force each one of you to answer them with literally 2 or 3 words, each one of you. So this is terribly unfair. I apologize to the question poser and to you. And the questions basically were getting at what is a big issue in education? This is both Paolo's question and Luba's question. They're very similar in flavor. If there was one thing you would pick on in education now that you would want us to focus on, what is that one area? So let me start. This is a hard question, so I'm going to give the toughest question to Fernando first. And then I'll move to the other 2 panelists. Fernando, you're muted.
I think the biggest priority should be to educate every student to see themselves as a member of a community and to understand their responsibilities to a community.
Fernando, thank you. Stefania? Unmuted, sorry, if you just unmute.
This question is about what kind of education we need. And I think we need a model, a content of education which gives a new kind of mindset, awareness, and behaviors. That means what we call a new global citizenship framework.
Michela.
We need inclusive inclusive education policies.
It's remarkable, I find, how similar what you all 3 just said is, which is positive for me, exciting for me, reassuring for me. We're out of time. I always like ending things when you feel like you ended too soon because you create an appetite. I welcome all of you to join our future events. I'm terribly grateful to Stefania, Michela, and Fernando for sharing their time. I'm also very grateful for all of you for sharing your time, listening to this fun conversation. I wish us all the best in this journey, and I pray and hope for a massively inclusive and well-rounded education for all of us. Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.